Do you view compliance as a necessary evil or a strategic advantage for your business? Today's expert is going to help you reframe that narrative. Plus, we'll hear his thoughts on emerging technologies that could make navigating compliance more effective. Expert Connections starts now. That's critical for businesses, but often highly complex and difficult to navigate. Welcome to Expert Connections. I'm your host, Julie Holton Smith. Today, we're talking regulatory compliance. Our guest expert is Matthew Price, founder and principal of MKP Strategies. He brings a wealth of experience helping organizations navigate these complex compliance landscapes. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Julie. It's great to be here.
I'm glad to have you because, Matt, I work with a lot of startups and really businesses of all sizes. And this is something that for many of them, they can relate to the complexity. So for those who might be new to regulatory compliance, can you explain why it's such a critical piece of business strategy?
Absolutely. The reality is it affects our business, our ability to sell, the methods we use and the approaches we take to marketing, the brand that we're desiring to develop and to support in the marketplace. All of those things are impacted by meeting the regulatory requirements that have been established for the products and services that we provide.
Okay, so when I think of compliance, I think of all these rules and guidelines, and it's something that you need to get right. It can be a scary thing for me to think about. And I imagine that a lot of business executives may be in that situation. But what are some common misconceptions that we might have?
I think the biggest misconception I deal with clients is this thought that regulations are intended to be black and white. It seems like they should, but they're absolutely not. One of the examples that I use, I do a lot of consulting in medical device regulation. And think about what medical devices are, what they're intended to do or to be. It could be anything from an implantable heart defibrillator that has electronics, software, hardware, things along those lines, all the way to a tourniquet, which in truth is nothing more than a broken rubber band. And yet there are a core set of regulatory requirements that apply irrespective of the type of medical device. So when you think about that, they're not intended to be absolutely black and white, but rather shades of gray that companies have to figure out where to draw the line in the sand to differentiate the black from the white, and then be willing to make adjustments as they learn more along the way.
Startups, of course, often have limited resources. And so when it comes to compliance, what's your advice for founders who are trying to prioritize compliance, but maybe don't have the budget for it?
Yeah, seek to learn what you know and what you don't know. And then when you come to that realization, supplement that lack of knowledge and experience. I talk a lot with clients about the need for wisdom. And startups and small companies are not exempt from the need for wisdom. Wisdom defined as the practical application of knowledge and experience. And so know the knowledge you have and you don't, the experience you have and don't, and be willing and ready to supplement that in ways as you build up that knowledge and experience within your organization.
So, of course, a lot of startups are looking at innovative new ways to do things. And I think right now, especially, we're in this climate with a lot of focus on technology, especially AI. How can they strike the balance between innovation and meeting those regulatory requirements?
Remember that those two things are not contradictory, or they shouldn't be. They really ought to be complementary. There are, in truth, a certain number of hurdles that have to be cleared in order to carry out business. What I have always seen the role of regulatory affairs and compliance to be is to remove as many of those hurdles as possible in the interests of the business. And then of the ones that can't be removed, do our best to make them as short as possible and as easy as possible for the organization to clear those. Because ultimately we're all on the same team, the same relay team running for the same finish line.
Okay, so let's look at making this business case for compliance. Many business leaders see compliance as a cost center or a necessary evil, if you will, rather than a strategic advantage. But you talk about that advantage that can come, that competitive advantage. So, how do you reframe that narrative?
First of all, understand the source of these regulatory requirements. They're honestly not um, agency individuals laying in bed at night trying to figure out how they can make industry miserable, right? And just adding more for the sake of adding more. They're intended to really represent a floor of measures to ensure safety and efficacy. As again, going back to medical devices, FDA is an example. When you consider the reason or reasons that the FDA was formed in the first place, it was back when individuals were selling snake oil and telling everyone that they could cure all ails, and in some cases we're actually harming or killing people. Another reason, the lack of sanitary conditions or poor sanitary conditions in meatpacking plants. And so the FDA was formed in the interest of protecting the health and the safety of the public. So when we think about it that way, and then see these things as a floor that has been established that is intended for all of our good. That's one thing. But then the other thing is realizing that we all have to understand those principles, those values, and apply them appropriately for the products and services we offer. That's what is needed to do things like mitigate risks, and including risks to profitability. Think about the amount of money that companies have to invest into doing something like recalls that
Mhm.
could have been avoided. We promote brand protection, right? Because I'm pretty sure most companies don't want their brand to be viewed as just okay, especially in the world of medical device and pharmaceuticals. And but then ultimately, whether it's in a life sciences space or another space, it's honestly needs to be a desire for the end user to experience that which you intended in the first place. Safety, effectiveness of the product and service that you're offering.
So Matt, when you're talking to your clients and you can tell that they're really looking at these regulatory issues or compliance as challenges or as obstacles rather than part of their strategy, how do you help them overcome that mindset?
To understand what compliance is and is intended to be and what it's not. I have seen companies on both extremes. One kind of takes a wonton, liberal approach, maybe cutting some corners that ultimately ends up affecting them in negative ways in a lot of ways. But I've also seen the other side of the coin where companies think that it's more is always better. The
Mm.
reality is more is not always better. Sometimes it's just more, and other times it's even worse. And so learning to strike that balance, not go to the extremes, and thoughtfully address these regulatory requirements for the company.
As much as we like to think that our businesses don't operate in silos, sometimes, that can happen. So you talk a lot about bridging the gap between teams like regulatory, IT, and engineering. Why is this alignment so important for businesses?
To me, it's boiling down what a business really is or intended to be. It's not so much products, it's not so much services or buildings or things like that. It's a collection of people working toward a common goal or purpose. And so we have to account for that. I often liken it to gears in a machine. No one gear runs the machine. It's the collection of those gears together. And it matters how those teams engage with each other, how they communicate, how they respect and value each other. And it's funny because the logo that I use for my company is a gear, and half of the gear is in design because it's also about how the gear teeth not only fit together, but that they fit together in a way that that operates the machine and doesn't damage the other gear in the process. And so that's what I spend a lot of time doing, is working in the space. Each of these groups, especially groups that are what I consider shared services, like compliance, like IT, that support pretty much every group within an organization. It's understanding the needs and the struggles that they have, and being a mediator, a facilitator, maybe a mediator in between those groups to help them to see, you could say, eye to eye, and work together to the best that they can.
Which sounds great, but what do you say to people who are struggling with that? Sometimes bringing those teams together, making sure they're in alignment, they're seeing eye to eye, especially around their compliance goals, that can be a struggle. So, what do you say to advise those clients?
Ultimately focus on the purpose of the company, the values that might be identified in the mission statement, and really help employees throughout to understand how you get from, in that case, concept to reality, from values that are important to your organization to the ultimate output or outcome that is desired. And a lot of that is seeing the bigger picture. It's looking at compliance and the requirements associated with it as stepping stones and not stumbling blocks, things that will help you get there, not prevent you from getting there.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. We have an entire segment on the show on technology, on AI. Obviously, a very important topic in this space. You've written about document-based versus object-based storage when it comes to technology. Can you explain why this shift matters for businesses, especially those in regulated industries?
Yeah, the truth is, businesses generate more and more useful data. In fact, more than they probably ever did before. In regulated industries, the outputs, which are often in the form of records, are what is used to prove whether or not you are complying with regulatory requirements that affect you. But they also contain a lot of useful business data that, if identified and harnessed, can be used for good, for improving operations over time, for looking for and at weaknesses and ways to bolster them, or reinforce those areas that were weakened. And what often happens is document-based systems where this data is recorded is often either a hard copy, or it's a soft copy PDF that gets stuck in and lost in a folder, a file, a drawer somewhere. And so I spent a lot, this is something that I always wished, when I started 30 years ago, I hate to say it, but that I had, and now it's becoming a reality. It also involves a cultural shift, at least in understanding that it's available and how to harness it, that is appropriate for a company.
Are there some emerging technologies, Matt, that are helping businesses to navigate compliance?
There absolutely are. A lot of them kind of fall in the product lifecycle management space. Those types of solutions that, from design to simulation to manufacturing, distribution, maintenance, traceability, has tools that can be used. It's a toolbox, right? These are all individual tools that then can be used for a common good or purpose for your organization. But what I'm finding is now, whereas in the past it seemed like every group would go out and get their own solution that were not connected to the others, now we're having the ability to have more of a base enterprise solution that all of these groups can have what they need in the way of tools, but ultimately those tools reside in the same toolbox. And so they're available, excuse me, to all, but also prevent inefficiencies like replicating master data in many places, which, guess what? No longer is master data. And so it's harnessing that power, it's simplifying, but is also giving these powerful tools to groups that are needed for the overall business and management of the product throughout its life cycle.
Are there any pitfalls to avoid? Anything that you want to watch for when you're evaluating what tools might be best to use? Or is that when you bring in someone who really understands the space like you? Because it seems like, especially with so many quickly developing tools using AI, and that it seems like you could maybe fall into maybe falling out of compliance if you're doing the wrong thing.
Absolutely. And I guess boiling it down, I'd say the first thing to remember is it's not all about you. When you're in an organization with lots of people with different groups, it's not about just what's best for you. It's really the sum, not its individual parts. And so when you go at it with that mindset, sure, you're looking for what it is you need for your particular um, needs, but it's also how it fits into the overall machine, so that hopefully everybody wins. In the end, that's ultimately the goal. And I do spend a fair amount of space trying to help. I've been fortunate throughout my career to not to just be in compliance, but have opportunities in other aspects of the business. I've worked for a very small company early on, fresh out of college, when I had just an incredible appetite for learning. Then I went to a mid-sized company, saw the differences. Before I opened up my own consulting business, worked for a 20 some billion-dollar company. So I've been able to see those different layers and levels, but also recognize some of the things that are common to all, irrespective of size, just maybe bigger to tackle because of the size of the company you happen to be in.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. So, with more than 30 years in this compliance regulatory, consulting space, I'm sure you've seen and learned a lot of lessons in leadership. And, these regulatory environments often viewed as technical and rigid. So, what leadership qualities have you found, do you think are most critical in these spaces in order to be successful?
Learning to be comfortable with ambiguity, because of the fact that these regulatory approaches, these compliance approaches companies take, have to be thoughtful to their specific company, their specific products and services, their circumstances, and being okay with that. And also understanding that there will come a point when one has to define where black ends and white begins on that particular day, right? Because the one thing that stays the same is change. So times and circumstances will continue to do so. And so it's doing that with a mindset to create a stable environment, and to be level-headed, especially when waters get rough.
Mm.
Because what I have found is that when, especially those in charge of or leading the charge on compliance, when they start to panic, it is not good for the organization. And so learning to deal with that. Also, I talk a lot about wisdom, using knowledge and experience, but it's not just those two things that are key to success. It's learning how to practically apply them, because there's a lot that have knowledge that struggle and fail. There's a lot with it, lots of experience that struggle and fail, but making practical application of that is key. And then knowing that periodically those things have to be reassessed. What might have been a perfect solution today, because of tomorrow's changes, might not be the best tomorrow.
I imagine as a consultant, you're often a translator between different departments, and as you're helping companies navigate all of this. So, what leadership skills do you find most helpful? I like how you mentioned, when you're in that stressful situation, that's when it matters most, how you respond and how you're leading your teams. But what other skills are really important in these situations?
First, I would say insight and empathy. Again, if you're thinking about the fact that companies are collections of human beings, working toward a common goal or purpose, guess what? So are the regulatory agencies, right? They are people. When it boils down, they are people. And so, seeking the insight, what it is that you're not seeing, that you need to see, at least with the eyes of your mind, to successfully accomplish. And when you see those things, especially about your teammates, regulatory, investigators, whatever, is having empathy. One definition I like for empathy is feeling their pain in your heart. And so using that to help you, and it ultimately, I think, helps develop patience and understanding along the way, which is key and critical. I also think, and I find sometimes it's easier for me, often it's easier for me as a consultant, one who doesn't have an exact stake in the game, you could say, is removal of emotion from some of those very emotional situations, especially if a company finds themselves in a little bit of difficulty or are out of compliance. And I've seen that to be key in helping organizations kind of allay or remove fear, right? That can drive bad decisions, overexcitement or overconfidence at times, and cause blind spots for them, or generally and most often feelings of being overwhelmed, right? If in order to get to the part of our brains of logic and reason, those impulses pass through the emotional center, we got to keep that emotional center under control so that we can think clearly, reasonably, and logically. And sometimes, and I've been on the other side of the table too. Sometimes you need somebody to come in and help through some of those difficult things. And then ultimately, I think another thing is just focus. I've been able to with all of these different voices, groups, but all working toward the common goal or purpose is to help keep from getting distracted on things unintentionally that take us off from the target or the goal or the finish line.
So interesting to hear you talking about all of these emotions when it comes to compliance, which is, a highly technical space. But also, as you said, there are so many emotions that go into it. And I love that you talked about empathy. I had an opportunity to hear a talk recently with an interrogator who was with the CIA, and he helped get the information that led to the capture of Saddam Hussein. And it was so interesting. His entire talk focused on empathy. And he
Mhm.
claims that that is exactly how the secret tool to getting information out of the enemy is to use empathy. And so, of course, compliance is not getting information out of the enemy, although sometimes maybe it feels that way. But empathy is such an important leadership skill. How can leaders also help within their teams? How can they foster a culture where compliance and innovation coexist peacefully together?
Yeah, great question. Easy to say, very difficult to achieve in some cases, but it's definitely achievable. Encouraging or creating a culture, fostering a culture within an organization to see the value of regulation and compliance. When we think back to what we talked about earlier, it's not just intended to be arbitrary hurdles just to make our lives miserable. It's really intended to establish a floor on which we can build with what should be a common goal or theme, the safety and efficacy of the products, the services we share. Also, that compliance is not, at least not just, the regulatory group's responsibility, right? There's a critical interdependency between all of the groups. It's the sum, it's not the individual parts that ultimately lead to a state of compliance. And, things happen. Uh, and at times we find ourselves out of compliance, and it's still that there's that critical interdependency to get back on track for the benefit of the company and those who are relying upon the company for the outputs or the outcomes. I find a critical thing or way to do this is helping those in the organization, and this is a cultural thing, understand the why behind all the what's and the who's and the when's, and help them to develop the art of how to figure this out, how to figure out and make good decisions now and continue to be mindful that they need to reevaluate those decisions in the future because things change. And lastly, remembering it's not all about you. It's not all about me. It's about us collectively, and we all win together. We all fail together, so we have to do our best to work together.
That theme keeps coming up, that it's not all about us. It's not all about you. That's a good life theme, I think. Matt, my husband just pointed out to me yesterday that we are like 10% of the year is already behind us. So even though we're in, at the time of this recording, the end of January, it's like, whoa, time moves quickly. If a business has only time to focus on one compliance related improvement this year, what would be a quick win?
Quick win is do some honest soul searching, confirm what you know and know what you don't know. To me, that's the biggest factor in success, or at least a big factor in success for companies and for compliance, is not proverbially getting ahead of your skis or in front of your skis, but to know what you know what you don't know, and then bring in resources to help you along the way for those things that you don't know. Unfortunately, in the fast-paced world that we live and that businesses operate under, at times this perceived need for speed causes corners to be cut. And with this idea that it doesn't hurt me right now, the reality is it will. And the longer you go, the bigger the issue gets, the more painful it will be to fix it in the future, as opposed to taking a little bit of time now. So helping to find that balance along the way is what I would encourage all business owners to do.
Yeah, and I'm sure in your space, you've seen both sides of that and would rather get involved before it gets to that painful point. Matt, you've spoken about cutting through complexity in compliance. So, what are some quick wins for businesses that they can use to implement to simplify their processes?
Take a look at what you have and what you're doing now in a spirit of simplification. Again, companies grow, businesses evolve, things get more complex over time. If we don't periodically inventory what we have and eliminate the clutter, it just gets more cluttered and more complex. And so I'll actually do a lot of work with companies now to look at what they have. I recently went through a project with a company with a goal of reducing the number of words they used in all of their compliance documentation by 40%.
Wow.
And it was amazing. Initially, the reaction was that is impossible. The reality was we ended up being greater than 40%, but it really highlighted the point that if you trim things out, if you say things more succinctly, not only do you use less pieces of paper, but it's easier for people to understand. And so things like that, look for ways that you can simplify more. Don't just keep adding to what you already have. Reevaluate what you have, look to enhance it, and hopefully look to remove some things along the way. And remember that the best decisions are not always the best. They may be the best today, but they might not be tomorrow. So be mindful of it. Periodically review what you have in order to be the best that you can be based on where you are and what you have today.
Matt, this has been so insightful. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure, Julie. Thank you.
Matthew Price, founder and principal of MKP Strategies. Appreciate having you here. We will include all of your contact info below. If you want to connect with Matt, I encourage you to do so. And be sure to stay tuned for our next video of this Business Connection series. I'm your host, Julie Holton Smith. We'll see you over in the next episode.